You know, every once in a while, a game comes along that doesn't just entertain people. It changes an entire hobby. And that game was Frank Mentzner's Basic Dungeons and Dragons, the famous red box. Now, before anyone heads to the comments, yes, I know it wasn't the first basic set. Holmes came first, then Mulvey. And I know there are plenty of folks who will tell you that BX is the greatest version of Dungeons and Dragons ever written. You won't get an argument out of me. BX is fantastic. But tonight, I'm talking about which edition has the cleaner rules. I'm talking about the one that taught thousands, maybe millions, how to become dungeon masters. Me, I learned on the black box, but that's for another video. I mean, just look at this thing. Larry Elmore's artwork. A lone warrior standing before a dragon. There's treasure piled high. Fire everywhere. The dragon doesn't look friendly. The fighter looks determined. And as a kid, you couldn't help but wonder, man, what's going to happen next? You know, what happened before this? What led up to this? That cover didn't just sell a game. It sold an adventure. And for a whole generation, it worked. Now, here's something you younger gamers might not realize. Back in 1983, there wasn't YouTube. There wasn't Twitch streams. No podcast explaining initiative. No Discord servers or Reddit. If you wanted to learn Dungeons and Dragons, you usually need someone to teach you. An older brother, a friend, that one kid at school whose backpack always had graph paper sticking out of it, or maybe the local game store. But for me, it was my cousin Shelly, and she changed the course of my life. But what if you didn't know anybody? What if nobody around you had ever played? Well, TSR realized that was a problem. The game was becoming more popular every year, and people wanted to play. But the rule books weren't really written for someone sitting alone at a kitchen table wondering, so how do I actually do this? That's where Frank Mentzer came in. He wasn't simply asked to revise the rules. He was asked to teach. And that is a very different job. So what did he do? He didn't start with charts. He didn't bury you under pages of rules. He invited you into a story. You basically became a first level fighter where you meet Alina and together you stepped into your very first dungeon. Every room taught you something, not because you were studying, but because you were playing. Need to make an attack? Well, here's how combat works. Need to avoid a trap? Here's a savings throw. Find treasure? Well, you know. Now let's talk about experience points. You never felt like you were reading a textbook. You felt like you were already playing Dungeons and Dragons. And that is a brilliant design. Honestly, I think it's one of the finest tutorials ever written for any tabletop game besides the black box. And then, of course, you meet Bargle. Now, if you played through the red box, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Poor Alina. Let's just say there are some villains you never forget. 40 plus years later, people still remember Bargle. Not because he had pages of backstory, not because he had some amazing statistics, but because Frank Mentzner understood something. If you make players care, then the story writes itself. But here's the part I think that often gets overlooked. The red box wasn't meant to be the finish line. It was the first chapter. Frank Mentzner and TSR had a much bigger dream. There was the basic set, the expert, companion, masters, immortals. what we call today the BECMI era. Think about that progression for a moment. You didn't just gain hit points. You grew into a legend. You start out fighting goblins with secondhand gear. And then later you end up building castles, managing kingdoms, leading armies into battle, researching spells that reshape the world. Eventually, you no longer worried about surviving a dungeon. You were shaping history. And if your journey continues long enough, you might even leave mortality behind. That kind of long-term vision is something we rarely see anymore. Maybe that's one of the reasons I still love these old games. They're not obsessed with perfect balance, rules, balances, and everything, power plays and all. They aren't trying to explain every possible situation with another rule. They trusted the dungeon master. They trusted the players. They expected you to make the rulings, to improvise, to create. And because of that, every table became its own legend. No two campaigns are exactly alike. And that is old school gaming. Not because it's old, because imagination came first. Eventually, BECMI would become the rules cyclopedia. This here is a reprinted copy. But you already know how highly I think about that book. It's probably the single greatest fantasy role-playing rulebook ever published. Not because it's perfect, nothing ever is, but because it contains almost everything you need to run years of adventures. And it all started with a little red box. So do I recommend Frank Mentzer's Basic Dungeons & Dragons? Absolutely. Not because it's nostalgic, not because it's collectible, but because it remains one of the greatest examples of how to welcome someone into this hobby that we all love. It doesn't assume you already know. It takes you by the hand and says, come on, let's go on an adventure. And honestly, I think our hobby could use a little more of that today. I want to thank you for spending a little time with me here at the Dungeon Rite. I'd love to hear your story. What was the very first role-playing game that opened the door for you? Was it the Red Box, the Holmes Edition, Mulvey, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or something completely different? I want you to leave it in the comments. I read every one of them. And until next time, take care of one another. Keep your dice rolling, keep your lantern burning, and never stop exploring the worlds that exist just beyond the edge of that map.